The Wild Horse Within. In the mountains of ancient Japan, where mist danced between cedar trees like whispered prayers, there lived a young monk named Zephyrus, who carried within his heart a restlessness that would not settle. Each dawn found him in the meditation hall, his breath forming small clouds in the cool air. Yet his mind wandered like a leaf caught in autumn wind. The monastery bells had just finished their evening song when Zephyrus approached his teacher, Master Aurelius, who sat beneath the ancient pine that had witnessed 1,000 seasons of seeking souls. The old master's eyes held the depth of still water, reflecting not judgment but infinite compassion. "Master," Zephyrus whispered, his voice barely disturbing the evening quiet, "I have practiced zazen for 3 years, yet my mind remains like a wild horse. When will I find the peace that others speak of?" Master Aurelius smiled, an expression so gentle it seemed to embrace the entire world. "Tell me, young one, when you look at this pine tree, what do you see?" Zephyrus studied the ancient tree, its branches reaching towards stars that were just beginning to pierce the darkening sky. "I see a tree, master, old and strong with many branches reaching in different directions. And does this tree struggle to be a tree?" the master asked, his voice soft as silk. The question settled into Zephyrus's mind like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread through his understanding. He had never considered such a thing. The tree simply existed, rooted and present, neither rushing toward tomorrow nor clinging to yesterday. As the night deepened around them, Master Aurelius began to speak in the rhythm of one who has learned to breathe with the universe itself. Long ago, there was a great teacher named Lysander who spent years searching for enlightenment in the most difficult practices. He fasted until his body became like paper, meditated until his legs forgot how to walk, and studied texts until his eyes burned with effort. Zephyrus leaned forward, drawn into the story like a moth to gentle flame. One day this teacher came to a riverside where an old woman named Seraphina sat washing clothes. Her movements were simple, unhurried, as she lifted each garment from the water, wrung it gently, and placed it on the rocks to dry her face, held such serenity that it seemed to illuminate the very air around her. The master's voice grew softer, inviting deeper listening. Lysander approached her and asked, "Good woman, how have you achieved such peace? What practices do you follow?" Seraphina looked up with eyes clear as mountain springs and smiled. "I wash clothes," she said simply. "When I wash, I wash. When I dry, I dry. When I fold, I fold. There is nothing else." Zephyrus felt something shift within his chest, like ice beginning to melt in spring sunshine. The story continued to unfold like a flower blooming in slow motion. Lysander stood there for a long moment, watching her hands move with the rhythm of someone completely present to the task before her. In that watching, something within him relaxed for the first time in years. He realized he had been searching everywhere except in the simple act of being exactly where he was. As Master Aurelius spoke, the evening sounds of the monastery created a gentle symphony. Crickets provided a steady rhythm. The wind through pine needles added whispered percussion, and somewhere in the distance, the soft chanting of evening prayers rose and fell like breathing. From that day forward, the master continued. Lysander's practice became beautifully simple. When he walked, he walked. When he sat, he sat. When he breathed, he breathed. He discovered that enlightenment was not something to be grasped like a butterfly in a net, but something to be lived in each moment of complete presence. Zephyrus closed his eyes, feeling the truth of these words settle into his bones. Around them, the monastery settled into its nightly rhythm of quiet contemplation and gentle rest. "Your wild horse mind," Master Aurelius said softly, "is only wild because you are trying to tame it. What if instead you simply rode with it? What if you became curious about where it wants to go, understanding that even its wandering is part of the great dance of being?" The young monk felt his shoulders release tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. The master's words were like rain on dry earth, soaking into places that had been thirsty for so long. "Tonight," Master Aurelius suggested, rising gracefully despite his years, "as you lie in your sleeping quarters, practice Seraphina's wisdom. When you breathe, simply breathe. When you feel your heart beating, simply feel. When thoughts arise, let them be guests in the inn of your mind, neither pushing them away nor inviting them to stay longer than they wish." As they walked back toward the monastery buildings, their footsteps quiet on the stone path, Zephyrus felt something precious beginning to bloom within him. It was not the dramatic enlightenment he had imagined, but something far more beautiful, a growing trust in the natural rhythm of his own being. In his small sleeping chamber, as moonlight filtered through paper screens, Zephyrus lay on his simple mat and began to practice this new way of being. Each breath became an opportunity to return home to himself. Each heartbeat became a gentle reminder that he was already exactly where he needed to be. The night wrapped around him like a soft blanket, and for the first time in years, his mind began to settle into the natural stillness that had always been there, waiting patiently beneath the surface of his seeking. The Garden of Empty Hands. The morning after Zephyrus's first taste of inner stillness, a new visitor arrived at the monastery gates. Her name was Celestine, a traveling scholar whose eyes held the weight of too much knowledge and too little wisdom. She carried scrolls and books like armor against the world's uncertainties, believing that somewhere in the accumulated words of ages past lay the secret to ending her restless searching. Master Aurelius received her in the garden where Brother Orion tended the vegetables with movements as deliberate and graceful as a tea ceremony. The old monk's hands moved through soil and seedling with such presence that even the earthworms seemed to pause in reverence. "I have studied the teachings of 100 masters," Celestine announced, her voice carrying the exhaustion of one who has traveled far but arrived nowhere. "I can recite the Heart Sutra in 7 languages and explain the philosophical differences between every school of Buddhist thought. Yet still, I find no peace." Master Aurelius nodded with the gentle understanding of one who had seen countless seekers arrive at these gates carrying the same beautiful burden. "Sister Celestine," he said softly, "tell me, what do you see when you watch Brother Orion work?" Celestine observed the monk's methodical movements, his complete absorption in the simple task of nurturing life from earth. "I see someone performing basic agricultural tasks," she replied, though something in her voice suggested she sensed there was more. "Brother Orion," the master called gently, "please share with our guest what you have learned in the garden." The young monk looked up, his hands still cradled around a delicate seedling. Soil clung to his fingers like blessings, and his face held the serene contentment of one who has found treasure in the most ordinary places. "When I first came here," Orion began, his voice carrying the rhythm of someone who speaks from deep listening, "I brought with me a mind full of theories about spiritual cultivation. I had read extensively about the metaphors of gardening in spiritual texts. I understood intellectually how tending plants could represent tending the soul. Celestine leaned forward, recognizing in his words the echo of her own approach to seeking. But the garden taught me something my books could not. Orion continued, gently placing the seedling into prepared earth. The first lesson came when I tried to make a lettuce plant grow faster by pulling on its leaves. The plant naturally died. I learned that growth has its own timing, its own wisdom that cannot be forced or hurried. As he spoke, a butterfly landed on his shoulder, and he remained perfectly still, honoring the tiny visitor's presence. The second lesson came during a drought season. I watched other novices worry and plan elaborate irrigation systems, while our teacher, Master Elias, simply continued his daily watering with complete attention to each plant's needs. When the rains finally came, our simple, consistent care had prepared the garden to receive the gift. The elaborate systems ironically created flooding that damaged many plants. Celestine felt something stirring within her chest, a recognition that perhaps her vast accumulation of knowledge might be creating its own kind of drought. But the deepest teaching, Orion said, his voice growing softer as evening approached, came from learning to work with empty hands. Empty hands? Celestine asked, puzzled. When I first began gardening, I approached each task with my hands full of expectations, preconceptions, and goals. I wanted the tomatoes to grow in perfect rows, the flowers to bloom according to my aesthetic preferences, the weeds to disappear completely. My hands were so full of my ideas about how things should be that I couldn't actually touch what was. The monastery bells began their evening song, and the three figures in the garden became silhouettes against the deepening sky. One day, Orion continued, I came to the garden feeling particularly frustrated with a section that refused to thrive according to my plans. As I knelt there defeated, I simply let my hands rest empty on the earth. In that emptiness, I felt for the first time the actual soil, its texture, its moisture, its temperature. I felt the pulse of life moving beneath the surface. And what happened then? Celestine whispered, drawn into the story despite her scholarly skepticism. The garden began to teach me directly. My empty hands could feel which plants needed water and which needed to dry out. They could sense where the soil was compacted and where it was loose enough for new planting. Most remarkably, they could feel the life force itself, the mysterious intelligence that guides growth according to laws far deeper than anything I had read in books. As darkness settled around them like a gentle blanket, Master Aurelius began to speak, his voice weaving seamlessly into the night sounds of cricket and wind. There is an ancient story about a scholar named Thaddeus who spent 40 years collecting every text ever written about the nature of water. He could describe its molecular structure, its behavior under different temperatures, its role in sustaining life. He knew the words for water in every language and could explain its symbolic meaning in various spiritual traditions. Celestine found herself settling into the story like sinking into warm water. One summer day, after a particularly intensive period of study, Thaddeus realized he was desperately thirsty. He reached for his water cup, but as he lifted it to his lips, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in 40 years, instead of thinking about water, he simply drank. The master's pause allowed the evening sounds to emphasize the profound simplicity of the moment. In that drinking, Thaddeus discovered that all his knowledge, while beautiful and vast, had been keeping him from the direct experience of water's gift. He had been so fascinated by the map that he had forgotten about the territory itself. Brother Orion rose gracefully from his gardening and began to walk towards the monastery buildings, his movements unhurried and fluid. As he passed, He touched Celestine's shoulder gently. "Tonight," he said, "if you would like, you could try sleeping with empty hands. Not empty of knowledge, but empty of the need to grasp or control. Let your hands rest open like cups waiting to receive whatever the night wishes to offer." After the others had gone inside, Celestine remained in the garden, feeling the evening air cool against her skin. For the first time in years, she set down her scrolls and books, placing them carefully on the wooden bench where they would be safe, but not immediately accessible. She looked at her hands in the moonlight, these hands that had turned countless pages, written endless notes and grasped after wisdom like someone trying to catch clouds. Slowly, she opened her palms towards the star-filled sky. As she walked to her simple guest quarters, Celestine felt something she had almost forgotten. The sensation of moving through the world without carrying the weight of everything she thought she needed to know. Her empty hands swung freely at her sides, and with each step she felt a little more space opening within her heart. In her small room, she lay on the simple mat and practiced what Brother Orion had suggested. Her hands rested open beside her body, palms up, ready to receive whatever gifts the night might offer. And as sleep began to approach like a gentle tide, she discovered that her empty hands were actually full of possibility, full of presence, full of the kind of wisdom that can only be touched, never grasped. The mirror of forgotten songs. 3 days after Celestine's arrival, the monastery received another unexpected visitor. This one came not seeking wisdom, but fleeing from it. Her name was Serenity, though she carried within her anything but the peace her name suggested. She was a former court musician whose hands had once created melodies that could move emperors to tears, but who now feared the very silence that music emerged from. Master Aurelius found her sitting by the temple gates at dawn, her fingers nervously tapping complex rhythms against her knees, as if trying to fill every moment with sound to avoid confronting the vast quietude that surrounded the monastery. "I cannot bear the silence," Serenity confessed when the master approached. In the court there was always music, always noise, always something to distract from the emptiness inside. Here in this quiet, I feel like I'm dissolving into nothing. The old master sat beside her on the stone steps, his presence as steady as mountains. "Tell me," he said gently, "what is it you fear about silence?" Serenity's hands moved restlessly, conducting invisible orchestras. "When everything becomes quiet, I hear nothing, and in that nothing I remember that all the beautiful music I created was just gone, vanished into air. What was the point of any of it if it all just disappears?" From within the monastery walls came the sound of morning chanting voices, rising and falling like ocean waves, and Master Aurelius smiled. "Come," he said, "let me introduce you to Sister Harmony. She was once like you, afraid of the spaces between the notes." They found Sister Harmony in the meditation hall, but she was not sitting in traditional zazen posture. Instead, she moved through the space with movements so fluid and graceful they seemed like visible music, her body creating shapes that spoke of deep listening and profound response to something beyond ordinary hearing. Sister Harmony practices what we call the meditation of forgotten songs, Master Aurelius explained softly. "Would you share with our guest how you came to this practice?" Sister Harmony completed her flowing movement sequence and turned toward them, her face luminous with the kind of joy that comes from touching something eternal. "I was a composer," she began, her voice carrying melodies even in speech. I believed that music was about creating sound, about filling emptiness with beauty. Serenity nodded vigorously, recognizing a kindred spirit. But I was always frustrated, Harmony continued, because no matter how beautiful the music I created, it always ended. Every performance concluded in silence, every composition eventually faded away. I began to feel like I was building castles from clouds, creating beauty that was destined to disappear. As she spoke, Sister Harmony began to move again, her gestures drawing invisible patterns in the air. Then I met an old music teacher named Melodious, who asked me a question that changed everything. He said, "Before the first note is played, where does the music live? And after the last note fades, where does it go?" Serenity found herself drawn into the mystery of this question, her restless fingers gradually becoming still. Melodious taught me to listen not just to the sounds, but to the silence that gives birth to every note and receives every note back into itself. He showed me that music doesn't come from instruments or voices, but from the vast, pregnant emptiness that contains all possible sounds. Sister Harmony paused in her movement, standing perfectly still in the center of the hall. In that stillness, the space seemed to vibrate with invisible music, as if the very air was alive with unheard melodies. "He taught me about the forgotten songs," she continued, "the infinite music that exists in pure potential, waiting in the silence like seeds, waiting in winter earth. These songs have never been played, and will never be played yet. They are the source from which all audible music emerges." "But how do you hear music that doesn't exist?" Serenity asked, though her voice carried a note of wonder rather than skepticism. "Through the practice of deep listening," Harmony replied, "not listening for something specific, but listening to the listening itself. In profound silence, you begin to hear the song that has been singing you into existence since before you were born." Master Aurelius gestured for them to sit and began to speak in the rhythmic cadence that transformed his words into their own kind of music. "There was once a master musician named Orpheus who could play any instrument with perfect technique and could compose melodies that captured every human emotion. Yet he felt hollow inside, as if all his music was merely clever arrangement of sounds, rather than true expression of the divine. The master's voice created a sanctuary of story around the three listeners. One day, Orpheus came to a remote mountain where lived an old hermit named Silence. This hermit had not spoken in 20 years, yet somehow his presence was more musical than any symphony. Orpheus challenged him, saying, "If you are truly musical, play something for me." The hermit simply smiled and sat in perfect stillness. Orpheus waited for hours, growing increasingly frustrated. Finally he shouted, "This is ridiculous. You're not making any music at all." The hermit nodded gently and said, "Exactly. I am not making the music. I am allowing the music to make me." Serenity felt something shift inside her, like a door opening in a room she hadn't known existed. The hermit continued, "Every sound you have ever created was already complete in the silence before you played your first note. Your instruments and your skill are simply ways of revealing what was always already present. But because you have been so busy making music, you have never learned to receive it." Sister Harmony resumed her flowing movements, and now Serenity could sense something different in them. Each gesture seemed to be responding to music that existed beyond physical sound, each pause honoring rhythms that pulsed beneath the surface of ordinary hearing. Orpheus spent the next year with the hermit, learning to listen to the music of silence. Gradually, he discovered that the emptiness he had been trying to fill with sound was actually full of infinite melody. The silence wasn't the absence of music, but the presence of all music simultaneously. When Orpheus finally returned to the world and played his first concert after this training, something extraordinary happened. The audience didn't just hear his music, they heard their own deepest songs reflected back to them. His playing had become a mirror for the forgotten songs that lived in every heart. As the story concluded, the evening light began to filter through the meditation hall windows, creating patterns of golden silence on the wooden floor. Sister Harmony's movements gradually slowed until she stood perfectly still, yet somehow her stillness was more dynamic than any dance. Tonight, Master Aurelius suggested to Serenity, "You might try the practice of listening to one forgotten song. Lie in complete silence and listen not for any particular sound, but for the listening itself. See if you can hear the song that has been singing you into existence all your life." "But what if I hear nothing?" Serenity asked, though her fear had transformed into curiosity. "Then listen to the nothing," Sister Harmony said gently. "Listen to it so completely that you discover it isn't empty at all, but pregnant with every song that has ever been or ever could be." As they walked to their evening meal, Serenity noticed something remarkable. The silence no longer felt threatening or empty. Instead, it hummed with potential, vibrated with invisible music that seemed to be composing itself moment by moment through the simple act of her listening. That night, in her small guest quarters, Serenity lay in the darkness and began to practice this new kind of listening. Instead of trying to fill the silence with mental noise or remembered melodies, she simply opened herself to receive whatever wanted to be heard. Gradually, she began to perceive something extraordinary. The silence wasn't silent at all. It was full of the most subtle music she had ever encountered, the rhythm of her own breathing, the percussion of her heartbeat, the whispered symphony of blood moving through her veins. And beneath all of this, something else, something vast and patient and infinitely musical. For the first time in her life, Serenity heard the forgotten song that had been singing her into existence since before her birth. It was a melody without beginning or end, a rhythm that pulsed with the very heartbeat of the universe. And in hearing it, she understood that every piece of music she had ever created had been nothing more than a single note in this vast eternal composition. As sleep approached like a gentle conductor, bringing a movement to its natural close, Serenity smiled. She was no longer afraid of silence, for she had discovered that silence was simply music, resting between movements, gathering itself for the next beautiful phrase in the endless song of being, the weaver of invisible threads. As autumn painted the monastery, grounds in shades of gold and crimson, a fourth seeker arrived at the gates. Her name was Luminara, and she carried with her the peculiar burden of seeing too much. She was what the villagers called a thread seer, someone who could perceive the invisible connections between all things, the intricate web of cause and effect that bound every moment to every other moment. This gift which others envied had become her torment. Everywhere she looked, Luminara saw the endless complexity of interconnection, the way every action rippled through the fabric of existence, creating consequences that stretched far beyond what ordinary vision could follow. The weight of seeing so much had left her paralyzed, afraid to move or speak, lest she disturb the delicate balance of the universe. Master Aurelius found her standing motionless in the entrance courtyard, tears streaming down her face as she watched a single leaf fall from the ancient maple tree. I can see how this leaf's falling will affect the path of that ant, she whispered, which will change where it takes its crumb, which will alter the feeding pattern of the bird that hunts such ants, which will influence where the bird builds its nest next spring, which will change how the sunlight falls on the ground, beneath which will affect which seeds sprout there. Her voice trailed off into overwhelmed silence. And so you stand frozen, the master observed gently, seeing so much that you cannot act at all. Luminara nodded, fresh tears falling. How can I do anything when I can see that every action creates infinite chains of consequences? How can I choose when every choice affects everything? Sit. Come, Master Aurelius said, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Let me introduce you to Brother Simplicity. He once carried a burden very similar to yours. They found Brother Simplicity in the monastery workshop, engaged in the ancient art of weaving. But as they approached, Luminara gasped. Through her gift of thread-seeing, she could perceive something extraordinary. Brother Simplicity was not just weaving physical cloth, but somehow working with the very threads of connection she could see binding all things together. His hands moved with perfect confidence through patterns that seemed to acknowledge and harmonize with the invisible web of relationship that Luminara saw everywhere. Yet there was no anxiety in his movements, no hesitation or fear of consequences. Brother Simplicity, Master Aurelius said, our friend Luminara has been blessed with the ability to see the threads that connect all things. Perhaps you could share with her how you learned to work with such threads without being overwhelmed by them. Brother Simplicity looked up from his loom, his eyes clear and peaceful. I was once exactly where you are now, he said to Luminara, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had traveled from confusion to clarity. I could see the web of connection so clearly that I became terrified of disturbing it. I spent months sitting in my cell, afraid to even breathe lest I create some cosmic catastrophe. Luminara felt a surge of recognition and relief. Finally, someone who understood. What changed? She asked, hope beginning to kindle in her voice. I met a teacher named Symmetry, Brother Simplicity replied, his hands never pausing in their weaving. She was also a thread seer, but she had learned something I had not yet discovered. She showed me that the web of connection isn't fragile at all. It's the most robust thing in existence. As he spoke, Luminara watched in fascination as his weaving seemed to pulse with the same rhythms she could see in the invisible threads that connected all life. Symmetry taught me through a story that transformed my understanding completely, he continued. She told me about a cosmic weaver named Infinity who had been tasked with creating the fabric of existence itself. Master Aurelius settled into a nearby chair, recognizing the beginning of one of the teaching stories that carried multiple layers of wisdom. Infinity began this great work with tremendous care, brother. Simplicity continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of storytelling. Every thread was placed with meticulous attention, every pattern planned with exhaustive consideration of consequences. The weaver worked slowly, fearfully, constantly, worried about making mistakes that might unravel the entire creation. Luminara found herself drawn into the story, seeing it unfold in her mind like another layer of the infinite web she perceived everywhere. But as Infinity worked in this way, something unexpected happened. The fabric that emerged was beautiful but rigid, static, lacking the dynamic flow that true life requires. The weaver realized that perfect control was actually preventing the creation from becoming fully alive. One day, Infinity made a radical decision. Instead of trying to control every thread, the weaver began to work in partnership with the fabric itself, allowing it to guide the patterns that wanted to emerge. This required tremendous trust, for it meant weaving without being able to predict or control every outcome. Brother Simplicity paused in his work and looked directly at Luminara. And do you know what happened then? The fabric became alive, Luminara whispered, seeing the truth of it in the threads of connection that danced around them. Exactly. The web of existence became self-weaving, self-correcting, self-healing. Every thread that was placed, even those that seemed like mistakes, was incorporated into the larger pattern in ways that served the beauty and functionality of the whole. As evening approached the monastery, bells began their gentle call to evening meditation. Brother Simplicity set down his shuttle and gestured for Luminara to come closer to the loom. "Look at my weaving," he said. "Can you see the mistakes?" Luminara studied the cloth with her enhanced vision. Indeed, she could see places where threads had been placed differently than originally planned spots, where the pattern had shifted, areas where what looked like errors had been woven into the design. "Yes," she said, "but I can also see how each mistake created unexpected beauty, how the deviations from the original pattern actually strengthened the overall design. This is the great secret that symmetry taught me," Brother Simplicity said, rolling up his work for the day. "The web of connection you see is not fragile, because it includes and transforms everything, even our so-called mistakes. When you act from genuine care and awareness, even your errors become part of the larger pattern of healing and growth." Master Aurelius rose and began walking toward the meditation hall, the others following. As they walked, he began to speak in the gentle voice that transformed the evening air into a sanctuary of story. There was once a master gardener named Genesis, who could see how every plant in her garden was connected to every other plant through roots and fungal networks, through exchanges of nutrients and information, through subtle chemical communications. Like you, Luminara, she could see the incredible complexity of these relationships. The master's voice wove through the evening sounds of settling birds and rustling leaves. At first, Genesis tried to manage all these connections, consciously, carefully orchestrating every interaction to create perfect harmony. But the garden under this kind of control became stilted and unnatural, lacking the wild vitality that makes gardens truly beautiful. One season, Genesis became ill and could not tend her garden for many weeks. When she finally returned, expecting to find chaos and destruction, she discovered something miraculous. The garden had not only survived, but had reached a new level of beauty and abundance. The plants had been caring for each other through their natural networks of connection. Luminara felt something beginning to relax inside her chest, a tight knot of fear and responsibility starting to loosen. Genesis realized that her role was not to control the connections, but to participate in them with trust and wisdom. She learned to act as one thread in the great weaving, contributing her part while allowing the larger intelligence of the web to guide the overall pattern. As they reached the meditation hall, Brother Simplicity turned to Luminara with a gentle smile. "Tonight, as you rest, try this practice. Instead of trying to track all the consequences of your breathing, simply breathe with trust that your breath is part of a larger breathing that includes all of life. Let yourself be woven into the pattern instead of trying to weave it yourself." "But what if I make a mistake?" Luminara asked, though her question carried more curiosity than fear now. "Then you will discover what I have learned," Brother Simplicity replied. "In the great web of connection, there are no mistakes, only threads that find their perfect place in patterns too vast and beautiful for any single perspective to fully comprehend." That night, Luminara lay in her simple guest quarters and practiced the art of being one thread in the infinite weaving. Instead of trying to see and control all the connections, she allowed herself to be connected, to be part of the web, rather than responsible for managing it. As she relaxed into this trust, something extraordinary happened. The overwhelming complexity she had always seen began to resolve into a pattern of stunning simplicity. She could feel herself held and supported by the same web that had seemed so fragile, cradled in connections that were far stronger and more intelligent than she had ever imagined. For the first time in years, Luminara fell asleep not in exhaustion from trying to control the infinite, but in the peaceful surrender of knowing herself to be a beloved part of something far greater and more wise than her individual understanding could contain. The sculptor of flawless stone. Winter had settled over the monastery like a meditation blanket. When the fifth seeker arrived, her name carried on winds that spoke of distant mountains and relentless seeking. Perfectia came bearing tools of precision and a heart heavy with the weight of never being enough. She was a master sculptor whose works adorned temples throughout the land, yet whose inner world was carved by the sharp edges of constant self-criticism. Master Aurelius discovered her in the courtyard before dawn, studying the monastery's simple stone Buddha with the intense scrutiny of someone searching for flaws. Her eyes moved across every surface, cataloguing tiny imperfections with the merciless attention that had made her famous and miserable in equal measure. "The proportions are slightly asymmetrical," she murmured to herself, unaware of the master's quiet approach. "The left ear sits 2 degrees higher than the right, and the smile curves more on one side. How can people find peace before such an imperfect representation? What do you see when you look at this statue?" Master Aurelius asked, gently, settling beside her on the stone bench, worn smooth by countless seasons of contemplation. Perfectia startled, then immediately bowed with the precise angles of someone who had mastered even the art of greeting. "Forgive me, Master. I see inadequacy, carelessness, 1,000 tiny mistakes that could have been corrected with more careful attention." "And do you find that the birds refuse to nest in the statue's embrace because of these flaws?" the master asked, gesturing to the small sparrows that had indeed built their home in the gentle curve of the Buddha's folded hands. Perfectia paused, confusion flickering across her features. "No, they seem quite content there." "Come," Master Aurelius said, rising with the unhurried grace of water finding its level. "Let me introduce you to Sister Acceptance. She once shared your beautiful burden of seeing every flaw." They found Sister Acceptance in the pottery workshop, her hands deep in clay that spun on a wheel, powered by the gentle rhythm of her feet. But as Perfectia watched, something extraordinary unfolded. Each piece that emerged from Sister Acceptance's hands was exquisite in its imperfection, bearing the subtle asymmetries and gentle irregularities that spoke of human touch rather than mechanical precision. "Sister Acceptance," Master Aurelius said, "our friend Perfectia is a master sculptor who carries the gift of seeing flaws with extraordinary clarity. Perhaps you could share how you learned to work with clay that refuses to be perfect." Sister Acceptance smiled, her hands never pausing in their dance with the spinning earth. "I was once exactly where you are," she said to Perfectia, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who had traveled from self-torture to self-compassion. "I could see every deviation from ideal form, every tiny flaw that marked my work as merely human rather than divinely perfect." Perfectia leaned forward, recognition sparking in her eyes. I spent years destroying more pieces than I completed. Sister. Acceptance continued, her hands shaping clay with movements that seemed to honor rather than dominate the material. Every bowl that was slightly lopsided, every vase with walls of uneven thickness, every cup that didn't match my mental image of perfection would end up shattered in the waste pile. But surely, Perfectia interjected, excellence requires standards. How can we improve if we accept mediocrity? Sister Acceptance lifted her current piece from the wheel, a simple tea bowl that was perfect in its imperfection, its gentle asymmetries, creating a sense of life and warmth that no mechanically perfect vessel could achieve. That question, she said, is exactly what my teacher, Master Kintsukuroi, helped me explore. He told me a story that changed not just my pottery, but my entire relationship with being human. As she spoke, Sister Acceptance began to work with gold leaf, applying it to a bowl that had clearly been broken and repaired the golden veins running through it like rivers of light. Master Kintsukuroi told me about a legendary potter named Idealis, who created vessels of such technical perfection that they were displayed in the emperor's palace. Every curve was mathematically precise, every surface flawlessly smooth, every proportion conforming to classical ideals of beauty. Perfectia found herself drawn into the story, watching how the golden repair lines transformed the broken bowl into something far more beautiful than it could have been in its original unbroken state. But Idealis was never satisfied. Despite the acclaim and recognition, he could see microscopic flaws that no one else could perceive. He drove himself mercilessly, seeking the perfect pot that would finally bring him peace. One day, after destroying his 1000th imperfect creation, he collapsed in exhaustion and despair. The workshop filled with the gentle sounds of evening preparation as other monks began cleaning their tools and closing their activities for the day. As Idealis lay there among the shards of his broken dreams, an old tea master named Wabi entered his workshop. This elder picked up one of the broken pieces and held it up to the light. "This fragment," he said, "tells a story that no perfect pot ever could. It speaks of effort and hope, of the beautiful courage it takes to attempt creation, knowing that failure is always possible." Sister Acceptance set down her tools and faced Perfectia directly, her eyes holding the gentle strength of someone who had made peace with being human. Wabi taught Idealis about a different kind of beauty, one that includes brokenness and repair, asymmetry and weathering, the marks that time and use leave on all living things. He showed him that the pursuit of flawless perfection was actually a rejection of life itself, which is inherently imperfect, constantly changing, always marked by the beautiful scars of existence. As they walked toward the evening meal, Master Aurelius began to speak in the rhythmic cadence that transformed his words into vehicles of deep wisdom. There was once a calligrapher named Precision who spent decades perfecting her brushstrokes until each character she wrote was a flawless example of classical form. Yet, the more perfect her writing became, the less it seemed to touch the hearts of those who read it. The master's voice created a sacred space around the three walking figures, drawing them into the timeless realm where teaching stories live. One day, Precision encountered an old monk named Spontaneity, whose calligraphy was filled with irregularities, splashes, and unexpected variations. Some characters were bold and confident, others tentative and seeking. Some brushstrokes were perfectly controlled, others seemed to dance with their own wild energy. Precision was appalled by what she saw as obvious flaws and approached the monk to offer instruction in proper technique. But as she prepared to critique his work, something stopped her. The people reading Spontaneity's calligraphy were weeping with joy, laughing with recognition, nodding with deep understanding. Perfectia felt something stirring in her chest, a recognition that perhaps her relentless pursuit of flawlessness had been taking her away from something essential rather than toward it. How can such imperfect writing affect people so deeply? Precision asked. Spontaneity smiled and handed her his brush. Write something, he said, but this time let the brush write through you instead of trying to control every movement. When Precision finally allowed her hand to move with natural spontaneity, something miraculous happened. Her brushstrokes became alive, carrying not just the meaning of the words, but the living presence of the person writing them. The imperfections became windows through which her humanity could shine. As they reached the dining hall, Sister Acceptance turned to Perfectia with a gentle suggestion. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, try this practice. Instead of reviewing all the ways you fell short of perfection today, notice 3 things you did with genuine care and attention. Not perfectly, but with love. But what if my imperfections cause problems? Perfectia asked, though her voice carried more curiosity than resistance now. Then you will discover what every master craftsperson learns, Sister Acceptance replied, holding up the gold-veined bowl that had been transformed by its breaking and repair. Sometimes our greatest beauty emerges not despite our flaws, but because of how we learn to work with them, how we allow them to be pathways for light to enter and love to flow through. That night, in her simple guest quarters, Perfectia practiced a new kind of attention. Instead of cataloging everything she had done wrong, she noticed the genuine care she had brought to her observations of the stone Buddha, the sincere desire for truth that motivated her critical eye, the love that lived beneath her harsh self-judgment. As she relaxed into this gentler way of seeing herself, Perfectia began to understand something revolutionary. Her ability to see flaws was indeed a gift, but it became a curse only when she used it as a weapon against herself and the world. When she could hold her critical awareness with compassion, it became a tool for creating beauty that included rather than excluded the full spectrum of human experience. For the first time in years, Perfectia fell asleep without reviewing a mental list of her inadequacies. Instead, she rested in the growing understanding that her imperfections were not obstacles to overcome, but threads in the unique tapestry of her being, contributing to a beauty that no perfect copy could ever achieve. The golden repair lines of acceptance began to form in her heart, preparing to transform every perceived flaw into a pathway for light, every mistake into an opportunity for the kind of beauty that can only emerge when perfection surrenders to love. The collector of moments. Spring returned to the monastery with the urgency of someone making up for lost time, and with it came a seeker whose very presence seemed to accelerate the peaceful rhythms of monastic life. Velocity was her name, though she insisted everyone simply call her Vel, as if even her full name took too long to pronounce. She arrived in a whirlwind of efficiency, carrying schedules and timepieces, her every movement speaking of someone perpetually late for an appointment with enlightenment. Master Aurelius found her in the garden at sunrise, not admiring the gentle unfurling of morning glory blossoms, but tapping her foot impatiently as she watched them as if willing them to bloom faster so she could witness flower opening off some invisible spiritual to-do list. "Master," she said, The moment she spotted him, her words tumbling over each other like water rushing downhill. I've read that meditation can bring enlightenment quickly if practiced intensively. I have 3 weeks before I must return to my duties in the capital. What's the most efficient approach to awakening? I'm prepared to meditate 16 hours a day if necessary. Master Aurelius settled onto the garden bench with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned to move in harmony with time rather than racing against it. "Tell me," he said gently, "what do you see when you look at that snail in crossing the path?" Vel glanced impatiently at the small creature making its slow journey across the stone walkway. "I see an inefficient transportation method. If I were that snail, I'd find a faster way to reach my destination." "And where do you imagine the snail is trying to go?" the master asked, his voice carrying the patient rhythm of someone who understood that some teachings cannot be hurried. Vel paused, suddenly realizing she had no idea what destination the snail might have in mind. I assumed it was going somewhere specific." "Come," Master Aurelius said, rising with fluid grace. "Let me introduce you to Brother Eternity. He once shared your beautiful urgency about spiritual progress." They found Brother Eternity in the monastery's clock tower, but instead of frantically winding mechanisms or checking timepieces, he sat in perfect stillness before an ancient water clock, watching single drops fall with the mesmerized attention of someone who had discovered infinity in the space between seconds. "Brother Eternity," Master Aurelius said, "our friend Vel is eager to make rapid progress in her spiritual development. Perhaps you could share how you learned to work with time rather than against it." Brother Eternity turned toward them with movements so graceful they seemed to unfold in slow motion, though Vel noticed that somehow he accomplished this turning with perfect efficiency, wasting no energy or motion. "I understand your urgency completely," he said to Vel, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had traveled from haste to presence. "I once arrived at this monastery with a detailed timeline for my enlightenment. I had calculated exactly how many hours of meditation, how many sutras to study, how many koans to solve. I was determined to achieve awakening in record time." Vel leaned forward eagerly, recognizing a kindred spirit. "What was your schedule?" she asked, pulling out a small notebook to record any useful information. Brother Eternity smiled, the expression transforming his entire face into something luminous. "My first week, I meditated from 3 a.m. to 11 p.m. with only brief breaks for meals. I read 12 sutras per day and spent my meal times contemplating koans. I was absolutely certain I was making tremendous progress." "And were you?" Vel asked, though something in his tone suggested the answer might be more complex than she hoped. "I was making tremendous progress at becoming exhausted, agitated, and spiritually constipated," Brother Eternity said, with gentle laughter. "By the end of that week, I was more anxious and scattered than when I had arrived. My mind felt like a pot of water boiling too rapidly to ever become clear." As he spoke, Brother Eternity gestured toward the water clock, where drops continued their patient fall, each one perfectly timed by forces far deeper than any human schedule. "My teacher, Master Kronos, found me one morning, collapsed in the meditation hall, muttering about spiritual efficiency and enlightenment deadlines. He sat beside me and asked a question that changed everything. 'In your rush to arrive, what are you leaving behind?' And the tower fell silent except for the gentle sound of water marking time in its ancient rhythm. and Vel found herself strangely calmed by the steady pulse of the drops. I didn't understand his question at first, Brother Eternity continued. I was focused on arrival, on achievement, on getting somewhere other than where I was. But Master Kronos told me a story that opened my eyes to what I had been missing. As afternoon light began to angle through the tower windows, casting slowly moving patterns on the stone walls, Master Aurelius settled into his storytelling voice, the words emerging with their own perfect timing. Master Kronos told Brother Eternity about a great runner named Swiftness, who was famous throughout the land for her speed. She could outrun horses, leap across rivers, and climb mountains faster than anyone had ever imagined possible. Vel found herself drawn into the story despite her impatience, something in the rhythm of the telling beginning to sow her internal racing. One day, Swiftness heard about a sacred grove where it was said time itself could be touched and understood. She immediately set out at her fastest pace, determined to reach this grove and claim its wisdom before anyone else could arrive there first. The water clock continued its patient marking of moments, each drop a small bell calling attention to the present instant. Swiftness ran through forests without seeing the trees across meadows, without noticing the flowers past streams, without hearing their songs. Her focus was entirely on reaching the destination, on achieving the goal of touching time itself. When she finally arrived at the sacred grove, breathless and exhausted, she found an old woman sitting quietly beneath an ancient oak tree. "Are you the guardian of this place?" Swiftness demanded. "Where can I find the wisdom of time?" Brother Eternity rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the monastery grounds, where other seekers moved through their daily routines with unhurried attention. The old woman smiled and said, "You have been touching time with every step of your journey here, but you were moving too fast to feel it. Time is not a destination to reach, but a companion to walk with. The wisdom you seek cannot be grasped by rushing, only received by arriving fully in each moment." Then, Vel felt something beginning to shift inside her chest, a tight knot of urgency starting to loosen as the story continued. "But I need to learn quickly," Swiftness protested. "I have so little time." The old woman laughed gently. "My dear one, you don't have time. You are time. You are not separate from the flowing of moments. You are the very consciousness through which time experiences itself." As the story reached its natural pause, Brother Eternity returned to his seat and looked directly at Vel with eyes that held depths of unhurried understanding. "Master Kronos taught me that enlightenment is not a destination we arrive at by moving faster, but a way of traveling that transforms every step into arrival. When I finally learned to meditate with time instead of against it, everything changed." "But how do you make progress if you're not pushing toward a goal?" Vel asked, though her question carried more curiosity than frustration now. "By discovering that you are already the progress you seek," Brother Eternity replied. "Every breath you take with awareness, every moment you meet with presence, every instant you stop rushing long enough to actually be here, is enlightenment happening. Not preparation for enlightenment, but enlightenment itself." As evening approached and the monastery bells began their gentle call to evening meditation, Master Aurelius offered Vel a suggestion that would have seemed impossible when she first arrived. "Tonight," he said, "try this practice. Instead of rushing towards sleep so you can wake up early and begin intensive practice, see if you can actually experience the process of falling asleep. Feel your body gradually relaxing. Notice your breathing naturally slowing. Observe how consciousness gently releases its grip on waking concerns. But that seems so slow, Vel said, though her protest carried less urgency than it would have hours earlier. Exactly, Brother Eternity said with a smile. Slow enough to actually experience what's happening. Fast enough that you don't miss the miracle of this moment transforming into the next. That night, in her simple guest quarters, Vel attempted something that felt revolutionary. She tried to experience time instead of race through it. As she lay on her sleeping mat, instead of mentally planning tomorrow's intensive practice schedule, she simply felt the weight of her body being held by the earth, the rhythm of her breathing naturally finding its own pace, the gentle transition from waking consciousness into the mystery of sleep. For the first time in years, Vel discovered that the present moment was not a brief stopping point between past accomplishments and future goals, but a vast, spacious realm where time revealed its true nature. Each breath was not just preparation for the next breath, but a complete universe of sensation and awareness. As sleep approached, not as an interruption of her spiritual practice, but as another form of meditation, Vel realized that enlightenment had been walking beside her all along, patiently waiting for her to slow down enough to notice its constant presence. In learning to move with time rather than against it, she had discovered that every moment was already perfect, every instant already enlightened, every breath already exactly what it needed to be. The urgency that had driven her for so long transformed into something far more sustainable, a gentle, persistent presence that could accompany her through whatever time remained, whether 3 weeks or 3 lifetimes. The keeper of fading memories. Summer's peak brought with it a seeker whose sorrow seemed to bend the very air around her toward tears. Memoria arrived at the monastery gates, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and a small wooden box that she clutched against her chest like a life preserver in an ocean of grief. Her eyes held the particular emptiness of someone who had loved deeply and lost completely, and her every movement spoke of a person learning to exist in a world that no longer contained what had made life meaningful. Master Aurelius found her sitting by the memorial garden, where small stone markers honored those who had passed from the monastery community over the centuries. She was speaking softly to her wooden box, her voice barely audible above the gentle rustle of bamboo leaves. "I brought your favorite tea," she whispered to the box. "The jasmine blend you said smelled like spring mornings. I know you can't drink it anymore, but I thought maybe if I brought it to a holy place." Her voice dissolved into quiet tears, and Master Aurelius approached with the careful tenderness of someone who understood that grief must be honored before it can be healed. "What precious memory lives in that box?" he asked, gently settling beside her on the stone bench worn smooth by countless seasons of mourning and remembrance. Memoria looked up with eyes that had cried so many tears they seemed to hold depths of accumulated sorrow. "My daughter's last letter," she said, her voice fragile as paper. "Her hair ribbon, a small stone she gave me on her 7th birthday, saying it looked like a heart. She died of fever 6 months ago, and I can't let go. I carry these things everywhere because they're all I have left of her." The master nodded with the deep understanding of someone who had walked beside many souls through the valley of loss. "And you fear that releasing your grip on these memories might mean losing her completely?" "Yes," Memoria whispered, fresh tears flowing. "If I stop carrying her things, if I stop talking to her, if I stop feeling this pain, what if I forget her? What if she disappears entirely?" "Come," Master Aurelius said, his voice carrying the infinite patience of mountains. "Let me introduce you to Sister Impermanence. She once held on to memories so tightly that she almost forgot how to live in the present. They found Sister Impermanence in the monastery's meditation garden, tending a special section devoted to flowers that bloomed for only a single day. As they watched, she was carefully watering morning glories that had opened at dawn and would close forever at sunset, her face serene as she offered care to beauty she knew was temporary. Sister Impermanence, Master Aurelius said, our friend Memoria carries the weight of profound loss. Perhaps you could share how you learned to honor memory without being imprisoned by it. Sister Impermanence looked up from her ephemeral flowers, her eyes holding a luminous sadness that had been transformed into wisdom. I lost my entire family in a single day, she said simply, her voice carrying the strength that comes from walking through the deepest darkness and finding light on the other side. Memoria's breath caught, recognizing a fellow traveler in the territory of devastating loss. A fire took our home while I was away. Sister Impermanence continued kneeling beside a flower that would live only until evening. My husband, my 3 children, my elderly mother. When I returned, there was nothing left but ash and the unbearable silence where their voices used to be. As she spoke, Sister Impermanence's hands continued their gentle care of the temporary blooms, each movement a meditation on the preciousness of what cannot last. For 2 years I lived like you do now, she said to Memoria with infinite compassion. I carried their belongings everywhere, spoke to them constantly, held on to my grief like a sacred duty. I was so afraid that healing might mean forgetting, that moving forward might mean leaving them behind. How did you find peace? Memoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Through learning the difference between remembering and clinging, Sister Impermanence replied, rising gracefully and walking to a small shrine where photographs and mementos were arranged with loving care, but without the desperate clutching that characterized Memoria's relationship to her daughter's belongings. My teacher was an old monk named Continuity, who had also experienced profound loss. He told me a story that changed my understanding of what it means to love someone who has died. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the garden, Master Aurelius settled into his storytelling rhythm, the words flowing like water, finding its natural course. Master Continuity told Sister Impermanence about a master gardener named Eternal, who had spent her life creating the most beautiful garden anyone had ever seen. Every plant was perfectly placed, every flower carefully nurtured, every tree lovingly tended. The garden was her masterpiece, her greatest joy, the expression of everything she held dear. Memoria found herself drawn into the story, her grip on the wooden box loosening slightly as she listened. One winter, a terrible storm destroyed most of the garden. Ancient trees were uprooted. Rare flowers were buried under debris. Carefully planned arrangements were scattered beyond recognition. Eternal was devastated, spending days walking through the ruins, trying to gather up fragments of what had been lost. Sister Impermanence returned to her work with the day-blooming flowers, her movements demonstrating a way of loving that included rather than denied impermanence. For months, Eternal tried to rebuild the garden exactly as it had been, using the fragments she had collected. But no matter how carefully she arranged them, the reconstructed garden felt lifeless, like a museum of what once was, rather than a living expression of what could be. One spring morning, as Eternal sat in despair among her failed reconstruction efforts, she noticed something extraordinary. In the spaces where the storm had cleared the old garden, new growth was emerging. Seeds that had been dormant for years were suddenly sprouting, taking advantage of the sunlight that could now reach the forest floor. Memoria felt something stirring in her chest, a recognition that perhaps destruction and creation were more intertwined than she had understood. Eternal realized that her beloved garden had not been destroyed by the storm, but transformed. The trees that had fallen became nurse logs for new growth. The scattered flowers had spread their seeds far beyond their original boundaries. The garden was continuing, but in forms she could never have planned or controlled. As the story reached its natural pause, Sister Impermanence approached Memoria with gentle directness. "The love you feel for your daughter didn't die with her body," she said. "Love is not a possession that can be lost, but a living force that continues to grow and express itself in new ways." "But I miss her so much," Memoria said, tears flowing freely now. "I miss her laugh, her questions, the way she saw wonder in everything. How do I live without those gifts? By letting them live through you," Sister Impermanence replied, kneeling beside Memoria on the garden path. "Your daughter's wonder at the world didn't disappear. When she died, it became part of who you are. Her laughter lives in your memory, not as a recording to be replayed, but as a frequency your heart can still tune into. Her love for you didn't end. It expanded beyond the limitations of physical form. As evening approached and the day-blooming flowers began their graceful closing, Master Aurelius offered Memoria a gentle suggestion that felt both terrifying and liberating. "Tonight," he said, "you might try this practice. Instead of talking to your daughter's belongings, try talking to the love itself. Feel for the living presence of your connection to her that exists beyond any physical object. See if you can sense how your love for her has grown larger, not smaller, since her death." "What if I can't feel her?" Memoria asked, fear evident in her voice. "Then you will discover what every parent who has lost a child eventually learns," Sister Impermanence said, her voice carrying the authority of lived experience. "The love between you and your daughter is not dependent on her physical presence. It's woven into the fabric of who you are, as permanent as the stars and as renewable as the sunrise." That night, in her simple guest quarters, Memoria attempted something that felt like the greatest act of courage she had ever considered. She set the wooden box down beside her sleeping mat instead of clutching it against her chest. With trembling hands, she opened it and looked at each precious object, not with the desperate clinging of someone afraid of forgetting, but with the reverent attention of someone honoring a sacred memory. As she held her daughter's letter, she read it not as a relic of the past, but as a living message of love that continued to speak to her heart. The hair ribbon became not just a fragment of what was lost, but a reminder of all the times she had braided love into her daughter's hair. The heart-shaped stone transformed from a memorial of absence into a symbol of the love that death could not diminish. For the first time since her daughter's death, Memoria felt the presence of love that was larger than loss, deeper than grief, more enduring than any physical form. Her daughter's essence hadn't vanished, but had expanded, becoming part of the very fabric of Memoria's being, woven so deeply into her heart that no separation was truly possible. As sleep approached like a gentle tide of healing, Memoria realized that letting go didn't mean forgetting or abandoning her daughter's memory. It meant allowing that memory to live and breathe and grow, to continue flowering in new forms, to remain a source of love rather than only a source of pain. The wooden box remained open beside her, no longer a desperate container for fragments of the past, but a shrine to love that continued to connection, that transcended physical form to the eternal dance between presence and absence, that makes each moment precious precisely because it cannot last forever. The invisible presence. As autumn painted the monastery in shades of gold and crimson, a seeker arrived so quietly that even the fallen leaves seemed to make more sound beneath her feet. Diminutia moved through the world like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. Her shoulders curved inward as if trying to protect her heart from the crushing weight of her own perceived insignificance. Master Aurelius discovered her not at the main gates like most visitors, but huddled against the back wall of the monastery as if even approaching the entrance directly would be presumptuous for someone like her. She was so still and small that he almost mistook her for another shadow among the evening shadows. "I'm sorry," she whispered when she noticed his approach, immediately starting to gather her few belongings as if to leave. "I shouldn't be here. I'm nobody important. I don't deserve to take up space meant for real seekers." "What makes you believe you are nobody?" Master Aurelius asked, gently settling beside her against the wall with the natural ease of someone who recognized sacred ground wherever authentic suffering was present. Diminutia's voice was barely audible above the whisper of wind through bamboo. "I've never accomplished anything meaningful. I have no special talents, no important insights, no gifts to offer anyone. I watch other people make differences in the world while I just exist, taking up resources, breathing air that more worthy people could use. Sometimes I wonder if anyone would even notice if I simply disappeared." The master listened with the profound attention of someone who understood that behind such words lay not self-pity, but a pain so deep it had convinced her that her very existence was a mistake. "Tell me," he said softly, "do you notice the small wildflowers growing here by the wall?" Diminutia glanced at the tiny blossoms barely visible in the gathering dusk. "Yes, but they're just weeds, nothing special." "And yet," Master Aurelius observed, "they have been quietly brightening this corner of the monastery for months. No one planted them, no one tends them, no one awards them recognition. They simply offer their small beauty to anyone who passes by. Are they worthless because they're not prized orchids in the temple garden?" Bah! Before Diminutia could answer, he rose with gentle grace. "Come, let me introduce you to Brother Humility. He once carried the same beautiful burden of feeling invisible and worthless." They found Brother Humility in the monastery's herb garden, tending plants so small and unassuming that most visitors walked past without noticing them. But as they approached, Diminutia realized something remarkable was happening. Each tiny plant seemed to radiate health and vitality under his care, and the air around the garden carried fragrances of extraordinary subtlety and healing power. "Brother Humility," Master Aurelius said, "our friend Diminutia struggles with feeling insignificant in a world that seems to value only grand gestures and obvious achievements. Perhaps you could share how you discovered the profound power of small presence." Brother Humility looked up from a patch of moss he was carefully tending, his face luminous with the kind of joy that comes from finding treasure in the most overlooked places. "I understand completely," he said to Diminutia, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had traveled from self-dismissal to self-acceptance. "For years I believed that because I couldn't do anything spectacular, I had nothing valuable to contribute to the world." Diminutia felt a flutter of recognition, a sense that perhaps she wasn't as alone in her struggle as she had believed. "I came to this monastery convinced I was the least promising student they had ever accepted." Brother Humility continued, kneeling beside a cluster of plants so small They looked like green confetti scattered on the earth. While other monks gave inspiring Dharma talks or created beautiful art, I found myself drawn to the most humble tasks: sweeping floors, washing dishes, tending forgotten corners of the garden. But surely, Diminutia said, those activities aren't really spiritual practice. They're just maintenance. Brother Humility smiled the expression, transforming his entire face into something radiant. That's exactly what I believed, until I met my teacher, Master Significance, who showed me something that changed my entire understanding of what makes a life meaningful. As he spoke, Brother Humility began to harvest tiny leaves from plants. Diminutia could barely see, each movement deliberate and reverent, as if he were handling precious jewels. Master Significance was himself someone most people overlooked. He was small in stature, quiet in speech, content to work behind the scenes, while others received recognition. But there was something about his presence that made everyone around him feel more peaceful, more confident, more themselves. The evening air carried the subtle fragrances of the herbs Brother Humility tended, and Diminutia found herself breathing more deeply, feeling something tight in her chest beginning to relax. One day, I confessed to Master Significance how worthless I felt, how I seemed to contribute nothing of value, while others accomplished great things. He listened with complete attention, then told me a story that opened my eyes to a completely different understanding of significance. As twilight deepened around them, Master Aurelius settled into his storytelling rhythm, his voice weaving meaning from the gathering darkness. Master Significance told Brother Humility about a great cathedral that was being built to inspire generations of worshippers. The project attracted the most skilled craftspeople from across the land, master stone carvers and brilliant artists who created windows that transformed sunlight into prayer. Diminutia found herself drawn into the story, her usual self-criticism temporarily quieted by curiosity. Everyone praised the magnificent work of these master builders, and rightfully so. But there was one worker whom nobody noticed, a quiet woman named Foundation, who spent her days deep underground, carefully placing stones that would never be seen by anyone who entered the finished cathedral. Brother Humility's hands continued their gentle work among the tiny plants, each movement a meditation on the value of unnoticed service. Foundation's work was precise and essential, but completely invisible, while others carved decorative flourishes that would be admired for centuries. She placed stone after stone in perfect alignment, creating the base upon which all the visible beauty would rest. One day, a young apprentice working on decorative details grew frustrated with his assignment, feeling that his work was too small to matter in such a grand project. He encountered Foundation as she emerged from the underground chambers covered in dust and exhaustion. The monastery bells began their evening call, their gentle tones seeming to emphasize the profound simplicity of the story being shared. "How can you find satisfaction in work that no one will ever see?" the apprentice asked Foundation. She smiled and placed her dusty hand on his shoulder. "Every stone I place," she said, "makes it possible for someone else's stone to be placed. Every invisible foundation stone I set with care ensures that the beautiful windows above will have something solid to rest upon." Diminutia felt something stirring in her chest, a recognition that perhaps she had been measuring her worth by the wrong standards. "But you'll never be remembered," the apprentice protested. "No one will know your name or praise your contribution." Foundation's smile deepened. Every person who enters this cathedral and feels their spirit lifted, every prayer that rises toward the ceiling, every moment of peace found within these walls will be held up by stones I placed with love. My name may be forgotten, but my care will support centuries of seeking souls." As the story reached its natural conclusion, Brother Humility set down his harvesting tools and faced Diminutia, directly, his eyes holding the gentle authority of someone who had discovered profound truth in the most humble circumstances. "The herbs I tend are so small that most people don't notice them," he said, "but they provide healing for stomach ailments, help with sleep, calm anxiety, ease pain. No one remembers my name, but the teas I prepare from these tiny plants bring comfort to dozens of people every month. The floors I sweep daily don't earn recognition, but they create a space where people can walk safely and focus on their spiritual practice without distraction. The dishes I wash in silence make it possible for the entire community to gather for nourishing meals." As they walked slowly back toward the monastery buildings, Master Aurelius offered Diminutia a gentle reframe that felt both challenging and liberating. "Tonight," he suggested, "as you prepare for sleep, try this practice. Instead of cataloging all the ways you feel insignificant, notice 3 small things you did today with genuine care. Not grand gestures, but simple acts of attention or kindness that might have made someone's day slightly better." "But what if I can't think of anything?" Diminutia asked, though her question carried more curiosity than despair now. "Then you will discover what every person who feels invisible eventually learns," Brother Humility said with quiet confidence. "Your very presence in the world creates ripples of impact that extend far beyond your ability to perceive them. Every breath you take with awareness, every moment you exist with even the smallest amount of kindness toward yourself contributes to the healing of the whole. The monastery has been more peaceful since you arrived," Master Aurelius added, his observation carrying the simple truth of someone who paid attention to subtle energies. "Your quiet presence reminds others that it's safe to be gentle, safe to be small, safe to exist without constantly performing significance." That night, in her simple guest quarters, Diminutia attempted something that felt revolutionary. She tried to notice her own positive impact, however small. She remembered holding the door for an elderly monk that morning, offering a tiny smile to a nervous newcomer picking up a piece of litter that had blown into the garden. Each small act, when viewed through the lens of Brother Humility's teaching, revealed itself to be not insignificant maintenance, but small threads in the vast tapestry of care that held communities together. Her quiet presence, her gentle attention, her simple existence were not problems to be solved, but gifts to be offered. As sleep approached, like a soft blanket of acceptance, Diminutia began to understand that significance was not measured by visibility or recognition, but by the quality of presence brought to each moment. Like the foundation stones that supported cathedrals, like the tiny herbs that provided healing, like the wildflowers that offered beauty to anyone who noticed her seemingly small life, was actually an essential part of the vast ecosystem of love that makes existence possible. For the first time in years, she fell asleep, not in spite of her smallness, but embraced by the recognition that in a universe of infinite complexity, every single element mattered, every quiet presence contributed, every gentle soul provided something that nothing else could offer. Her insignificance revealed itself to be profound significance, wearing the humble clothing of modesty. The flame that burns bridges. Winter's grip tightened around the monastery when the 9th seeker arrived, her presence crackling with barely contained lightning that seemed to charge the very air around her. Tempest was her name, and it suited her perfectly, for she moved through the world like a storm that had forgotten how to be still. Her jaw was set in permanent tension, her hands clenched into fists even in sleep, and her eyes burned with the accumulated rage of 1,000 perceived injustices that had never found resolution. Master Aurelius encountered her not in peaceful contemplation, but pacing furiously in the monastery courtyard, her footsteps wearing a groove in the ancient stones as she muttered a litany of grievances against the world that had treated her so unfairly. 20 years I worked for that company, she was saying to the empty air, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. 20 years of loyalty, of staying late, of sacrificing my personal life for their success. And they replaced me with someone half my age and half my experience, because she was willing to work for less. 20 years thrown away like garbage. Her anger was so palpable that even the winter birds seemed to avoid the courtyard, as if sensing the emotional storm that surrounded her like an invisible hurricane. And my family, she continued, her pace quickening with each word, they act like I should just get over it, like decades of betrayal and disappointment should just be forgotten because it makes them uncomfortable when I tell the truth about how the world really works. Master Aurelius approached slowly, understanding that anger this deep was often grief wearing armor, pain that had hardened into fury to avoid the vulnerability of acknowledging how deeply it hurt to be treated with such casual cruelty. "What would it feel like," he asked gently, "if you could set down that heavy load you've been carrying?" Tempest whirled to face him, her eyes flashing with the dangerous light of someone whose anger had become both weapon and shield. "Set it down. This anger is the only thing that keeps me going. Without it, I'd just be a victim, just another person the world has chewed up and spit out. At least this way I have fire. Come." Master Aurelius said, his voice carrying the unshakable calm of deep water that cannot be disturbed by surface storms. "Let me introduce you to Sister Transformation. She once carried a fire very much like yours." They found Sister Transformation in the monastery's forge, working with actual flames to shape metal into beautiful, useful objects. But as they watched, Tempest noticed something extraordinary. The sister's relationship with fire was not one of battle or domination, but of deep partnership, as if she had learned to dance with the very element that had once threatened to consume her. Sister Transformation. Master Aurelius said, "Our friend Tempest carries the sacred fire of righteous anger, but it has become a burden that burns her more than it illuminates her path. Perhaps you could share how you learned to transform rage into wisdom." Sister Transformation looked up from her work, her face glowing with the reflected light of the forge, and Tempest was startled to see not the hardened features of someone who had battled the world, but the serene countenance of someone who had made peace with life's inherent unfairness. "I burned with rage for 15 years, she said to Tempest, her voice carrying the strength of someone who had walked through the fire and emerged refined rather than destroyed. "My anger was justified, righteous, completely understandable. I had been betrayed by those I loved, cheated by those I trusted, abandoned by those who had promised to stand by me." Tempest felt a surge of recognition, finally meeting someone who understood that the world really was as cruel and unfair as she had experienced it to be. "My rage felt like the only honest response to a dishonest world." Sister Transformation continued, carefully adjusting the flames with movements that spoke of deep respect for the power she was working with. "Everyone else seemed to live in denial, pretending that things were fair when they clearly weren't, acting as if kindness and justice actually mattered when experience had proven otherwise. "Exactly," Tempest said, her voice crackling with vindication. "Finally, someone who sees clearly. How did you maintain your sanity in a world full of people who refuse to acknowledge reality?" Sister Transformation smiled, and in that smile Tempest glimpsed something she hadn't expected, not the bitter satisfaction of shared cynicism, but a warmth that seemed to embrace even life's cruelties with understanding. "I didn't maintain my sanity," she said simply. "I lost it completely. The anger I thought was protecting me was actually consuming me from the inside. I became someone I didn't recognize, someone whose entire identity was built around what others had done wrong, rather than who I actually was beneath all that justified fury." As she spoke, Sister Transformation pulled a piece of glowing metal from the forge, and Tempest watched in fascination as the raw, chaotic heat was gradually shaped into something beautiful and purposeful. My teacher was a monk named Forgiveness, though when I first met him, I thought his name was ridiculous. How could anyone forgive the kinds of betrayals and injustices I had suffered? Forgiveness seemed like spiritual bypassing, like denial dressed up in holy clothes. The forge crackled and hissed, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the natural breathing of someone who had learned to work with rather than against life's difficulties. But forgiveness taught me something I had never considered. He told me a story that changed my understanding of what anger actually is and what it's trying to accomplish. As evening settled around them, and the forge became the primary source of light in the darkening workshop, Master Aurelius began to speak in the cadence that transformed his words into vessels of deep teaching. Forgiveness told Sister Transformation about a great warrior named Justice, who had dedicated her life to fighting wrongs and defending the innocent. She was skilled with sword and shield, fearless in battle, absolutely committed to protecting those who could not protect themselves. Tempest found herself drawn into the story, seeing in this warrior a reflection of her own fierce commitment to acknowledging and resisting unfairness. Justice fought many battles and won many victories, but gradually she noticed something troubling. Each victory required her to become a little harder, a little more suspicious, a little more ready to see enemies everywhere. The armor she wore to protect her in battle became heavier and heavier until she could barely move beneath its weight. Sister Transformation continued her work with the heated metal, each hammer blow precise and purposeful, transforming raw material into refined beauty. One day, after a particularly difficult battle, Justice encountered an old woman sitting by a river, completely unarmed and apparently defenseless. Justice immediately began to warn her about all the dangers in the area, all the enemies who might attack, all the reasons she needed to be armed and ready for battle. The old woman listened patiently, then said something that stopped Justice in her tracks. "My dear warrior, I can see that your armor has kept you safe from many attacks, but tell me, when did you last feel the sun on your skin?" Yeah. Tempest felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that perhaps her anger, justified as it was, had become a kind of armor that protected her from more than just injustice. Justice looked down at her heavy armor and realized she couldn't remember the last time she had felt anything directly. She had been so protected from life's blows that she had also been protected from life's gifts. Her strength had become a prison, her vigilance a barrier between herself and the very life she was trying to defend. "But if I remove my armor," Justice protested, "I'll be vulnerable to attack." The old woman nodded. "Yes, you will be vulnerable to being hurt. you will also be vulnerable to being loved, to being surprised by beauty, to being touched by kindness. The choice is yours. You can remain safe and numb, or you can risk feeling everything. As the story reached its natural pause, Sister Transformation set down her hammer and looked directly at Tempest with eyes that held both strength and softness, fire and water, in perfect balance. "The anger you carry is not wrong," she said. "It's information. It's telling you that you value justice, that you recognize when things are not as they should be, that you have standards for how people ought to treat each other. These are beautiful qualities. But when anger becomes a permanent state rather than a temporary response, it stops serving its purpose. Instead of motivating action that creates positive change, it becomes a fire that burns the one carrying it." Tempest felt tears threatening a vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "But if I let go of the anger, won't I just be letting them win? Won't I be saying that what they did was okay? What if," Sister Transformation suggested gently, "letting go of the anger was the most powerful thing you could do? What if the greatest victory was refusing to let their actions determine the quality of your inner life?" As they walked toward the monastery dining hall, Master Aurelius offered Tempest a practice that felt both terrifying and liberating. "Tonight," he said, "you might try this experiment. For just a few minutes before sleep, imagine setting down the heavy armor of your anger, not permanently, but just for a brief rest. See what it feels like to exist without carrying the weight of everyone else's failures." "But what if I become weak?" Tempest asked, though her question carried more curiosity than resistance now. "Then you will discover what every warrior eventually learns," Sister Transformation said with quiet confidence. "True strength doesn't come from hardening against life, but from developing the flexibility to bend without breaking the resilience, to feel deeply without being destroyed by what you feel." That night, in her simple guest quarters, Tempest attempted something that felt like the greatest act of courage she had ever considered. She imagined just for a moment what it might feel like to exist without anger as her constant companion. As she lay in the darkness, she began to sense something she had almost forgotten existed beneath the layers of justified fury, a deep tiredness, a longing for peace, a heart that had been protecting itself so successfully that it had almost forgotten how to rest. Gradually, carefully, like someone removing armor after a long battle, Tempest allowed herself to feel the vulnerability that lived beneath her rage, and in that vulnerability, she discovered something unexpected. Not weakness, but a different kind of strength. The strength that comes from being willing to feel everything, to remain open even in a world that often rewarded hardness. For the first time in years, Tempest fell asleep, not clutching her anger like a weapon, but cradled by the possibility that perhaps the greatest revolution would be refusing to let others' failures poison her own heart, choosing to remain tender in a hard world, not as surrender, but as the ultimate victory. The forge had taught her that fire could be used to create beauty as well as destruction, and anger, she was beginning to understand, could be transformed from a weapon that wounded the wielder into a force that illuminated the path toward justice, compassion, and genuine change. The circle of returning. Spring returned to the monastery with the gentle insistence of a promise kept, and with it came an unexpected gathering. One by one, the seekers who had found their way to Master Aurelius over the past year began to return, not as desperate pilgrims fleeing their inner turmoil, but as transformed beings carrying the light of understanding they had discovered in the depths of their own hearts. Zephyrus arrived first, his movements now flowing with the natural rhythm of someone who had learned to ride with his wild horse mind rather than fight against it. Behind him came Celestine, her hands empty of scrolls but full of the wisdom that can only be touched, never grasped. Serenity followed her silence, no longer fearful but rich with the music of forgotten songs that had finally remembered themselves. Sister Luminara walked beside Brother Orion, her thread-seeing eyes, now perceiving the web of connection as a support rather than a burden, while Perfectia carried with her a small sculpture that bore the golden veins of intentional repair, beautiful in its acknowledged imperfection. Vel moved with unhurried grace, having discovered that time was not a river to race, but an ocean to swim in, and Memoria carried her daughter's memory not as a weight, but as a light that illuminated every step. Diminutia came quietly, as was her way, but her presence had grown from invisible to luminous, radiating the profound significance of small things perfectly attended to. And, finally, Tempest arrived, her anger transformed into a forge fire that created rather than destroyed her rage, refined into a passion for justice that served rather than consumed. Master Aurelius found them gathered in the meditation hall as evening approached, not sitting in the formal arrangement of students before a teacher, but in a circle that had no beginning and no end. Each person, both teacher and student, each story, both complete and part of a larger narrative that continued to unfold. "You have all returned," he observed with a smile that seemed to embrace the entire gathered community. "But you are not the same people who left. What have you discovered in your time away from this place?" Zephyrus spoke first, his voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who had made friends with uncertainty. "I discovered that the wild horse of my mind was not an enemy to be tamed, but a teacher showing me the untamed vitality of awakened awareness. When I stopped trying to control the ride, I found that consciousness itself was the rider, and the mind was simply the landscape we moved through together." Celestine nodded, her words flowing like water, finding its natural course. "I learned that all my knowledge was beautiful, but it became wisdom only when held with empty hands. The texts I studied for years revealed their deepest teachings only when I stopped grasping them as possessions and began receiving them as gifts that were meant to flow through me, not accumulate within me." Serenity's contribution came not in words, but in a gentle humming that seemed to make the air itself more musical. When she did speak, her voice carried melodies that had been born in the silence between sounds. I found the forgotten songs that had been singing me into existence all along. In learning to listen to the music of emptiness, I discovered that silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of all possible sounds in their pure potential. Luminara's eyes sparkled with the joy of someone who had learned to see connection as gift rather than responsibility. The threads I perceived binding all things together were not chains to be managed, but the very fabric of love itself. When I stopped trying to control the web and learned to dance with it, I discovered that I was never separate from the vast intelligence that weaves all existence into its perfect pattern. Perfectia held up her golden-veined sculpture, the repaired breaks creating patterns more beautiful than any unbroken surface could achieve. I learned that my imperfections were not flaws to hide, but pathways for light to enter. The cracks in my creations, like the cracks in my heart, became places where healing could flow in and beauty could flow out. Brother Orion spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had learned to tend inner gardens with the same care he brought to external ones. In working with empty hands, I discovered that the most profound cultivation happens when we stop trying to force growth and start creating conditions where life can flourish according to its own deep wisdom. Vel's words came with the spacious timing of someone who had learned to move in harmony with time rather than against it. I discovered that enlightenment is not a destination to reach quickly, but a way of traveling that transforms every step into arrival. When I stopped racing toward awakening, I found that I was already awake and had been all along. Memoria's voice carried the strength of someone who had learned to love beyond the boundaries of physical form. I found that the love I felt for my daughter didn't die with her body, but expanded beyond all limitations. In learning to honor memory without being imprisoned by it, I discovered that love is the one thing that grows stronger rather than weaker when we learn to hold it with open hands. Diminutia spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered profound significance in seeming insignificance. I learned that my small presence was not a problem to solve, but a gift to offer. Like the tiny herbs that provide great healing, my quiet existence contributes something essential to the vast ecosystem of care that holds all life together. Tempest's words carried the refined strength of someone who had learned to work with fire rather than be consumed by it. I discovered that my anger was not wrong, but misdirected. When I stopped using it as armor against life and started using it as fuel for positive change, it transformed from a source of suffering into a force for justice and healing. As each person shared their discoveries, something remarkable happened in the circle. The individual stories began to weave together into a larger pattern, each person's healing contributing to the others, each insight illuminating aspects of the others' journeys that had been hidden before. Master Aurelius listened to each sharing with the profound attention of someone who understood that teaching happens not through giving answers, but through creating bases where wisdom can emerge naturally. When the sharing was complete, he began to speak in the rhythm that had carried so many stories and touched so many hearts over the years. There is an ancient teaching about 10 mirrors arranged in a circle, he said, his voice creating a sacred space that seemed to hold all the stories that had been shared and all the wisdom that had been discovered. Each mirror reflects not just the light that falls upon it, but the light reflected from every other mirror in the circle. The group settled into the deep listening that had become their natural state, each person both receiving and contributing to the collective understanding that was emerging. When the mirrors are properly aligned, the master continued, they create an infinite multiplication of light, each reflection becoming brighter and more luminous because of its connection to all the others. The light that emerges from this circle of mirrors is not just the sum of the individual reflections, but something entirely new, something that could not exist without the unique contribution of each mirror. As he spoke, the evening light filtering through the meditation hall windows seemed to demonstrate his words, creating patterns of luminous interconnection that danced across the walls and faces of the gathered seekers. Each of you came here carrying a particular form of suffering, a specific way that consciousness had become contracted or confused. But in working with your individual challenges, you discovered something that extends far beyond personal healing. You found that your suffering was not separate from the larger patterns of human experience, but a doorway into understanding the very nature of consciousness itself. Zephyrus learned that the wild mind is not a problem but awakened awareness expressing its infinite creativity. Celestine discovered that knowledge becomes wisdom only when held with the empty hands of presence. Serenity found that silence is not absence but the fullness from which all expression emerges. Each person felt themselves both recognized individually and woven into the larger tapestry of understanding that was emerging through their collective presence. Luminara learned that the web of connection is not a burden to manage, but a gift to participate in. Perfectia discovered that flaws are not obstacles to beauty, but pathways for light to enter. Orion found that the most profound cultivation happens through empty hands and open hearts. Vel learned that time is not a river to race, but an ocean to swim in. Memoria discovered that love expands rather than diminishes when we learn to hold it beyond the boundaries of form. Diminutia found that small presence is not insignificant but essential to the vast ecosystem of care. And Tempest learned that anger can be transformed from a fire that destroys into a force that creates and heals. As the Master's words wove together all the individual journeys into a coherent understanding, each person in the circle began to sense something extraordinary happening. They were no longer just individual seekers who had found their own healing, but part of a living mandala of consciousness, exploring itself through the vehicle of human experience. The monastery, Master Aurelius said, as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, is not a place, but a state of consciousness. You carry it with you wherever you go, not as a memory, but as a living reality that continues to unfold through your presence in the world. Tonight, as you rest in what may be your final night together in this form, remember that the circle you have created here is eternal. The love you have discovered, the wisdom you have embodied, the healing you have realized continues to ripple outward through every life you touch, every moment you meet with presence, every breath you take with awareness. As the group prepared to rest, they found themselves naturally arranging their sleeping mats in the same circle they had formed for sharing, as if their bodies understood something their minds were still discovering. The meditation hall became a sanctuary of gentle breathing of hearts that had learned to beat in harmony with the vast rhythm of existence itself. In the deep hours of the night, as consciousness softened into the mysterious realm of sleep, each person experienced something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They dreamed not individual dreams, but participated in a collective vision of the vast web of interconnection that holds all existence in its embrace. They saw themselves as stars in a constellation of consciousness, each one unique and essential, each one contributing to a pattern of light that illuminated the darkness for countless other seekers who would follow. They understood that their individual healing had become part of the healing of the whole, their personal awakening part of the awakening of consciousness itself. When morning came, they would each return to their lives in the world, but they would carry with them the unshakable knowledge that they were never alone, never separate, never insignificant. They had become part of something vast and eternal, contributors to the ongoing creation of a world where consciousness could know itself through the vehicle of compassion, wisdom, and love. The monastery would remain ready to welcome the next wave of seekers, but it would also travel with them, continuing to unfold through their presence in the world, through their willingness to be both student and teacher, both wounded and healer, both human and divine. In the end, they had discovered that the greatest teaching was not something to be learned, but something to be lived, not something to be grasped, but something to be embodied, not something to be achieved, but something to be shared with every being they encountered on the endless journey of consciousness, coming to know itself through the beautiful, broken, perfect vehicle of human experience.